I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case. The stone at Betrayal carries its years like a man who has kept too many secrets. I stood just beyond the quad, coat unbuttoned, the collar turned up more by habit than weather. The late afternoon sun spilled across the slate like melted brass, and the warm hush of the hour made me think of old hymns, not sung, but remembered. To my right, on a bench not far from the sundial, a student folded his knees up like a frightened sparrow, frowning at a newspaper crossword, pencil poised like a reluctant scalpel. I watched the tip hover and hesitate, then drop abandoned. A moment later I spoke. "Lapidary," I said. Without looking, I heard his soft breath catch, not annoyance, more the startled exhale of someone who thinks he is alone and suddenly isn't. He didn't thank me. He didn't need to. We were both trespassing in that hour between lectures and darkness. When Oxford pulls up its shawl of stone and whispers to itself, I had come to look again at the inscription beneath the archway, not because I had forgotten it, but because forgetting is a slow art and one must rehearse. Nisi Dominus edificavere domum. The words were worn down, the middle eaten away by centuries of damp fingers, oil, air. Without the Lord it began, and then faltered, like most things, really. My knee ached. I'd walked too much the day before, and now the climb of even shallow steps came with a stubborn fire. I shifted my weight, irritated not by the pain but by the weakness it insisted on revealing. In my breast pocket was a letter. Folded twice, still crisp at the edges. I hadn't replied. I wouldn't. Her name looked foreign now, even in familiar ink. I had read it 3 times this morning before slipping it away again, as if the meaning might soften overnight. Say it hadn't. A bell somewhere struck 4, hard, too quick, too clean. My phone vibrated. Not rang, it vibrated. A small efficient shudder that felt obscene in this quiet. I drew it out like an apology. Strange how even silence here feels formal, as if one must request permission before breaking it. Lewis's voice was brisk. "A body, sir. Betrayal. The old East Wing." Beneath the steps, I said nothing for a moment. The East Wing, disused since the refurbishment, its windows shuttered like a sleeping house. There had been whispers of opening it again, of breathing it back into the college's slow rhythm. But I knew better than to trust resurrection, where neglect had laid down roots. I turned and walked. Past the bench, where the student now looked up, uncertain whether to meet my eye. He didn't. He went back to his paper, though I knew he'd left his pen uncapped and idle in his lap. The steps curled tightly around the side of the East Wing, where the air turned cooler and the sun began to slant. There was a stillness there, not peace precisely, but the hush of somewhere not expecting to be entered. A constable nodded me through. There were more of them inside, the quiet shuffle of young officers trying not to echo too loudly in a place that did not welcome sudden movement. The body lay just beneath the landing. Male, early 50s. Though time had not been kind, the head tilted at an unnatural angle, mouth open slightly as if catching the last words of a lecture, long since ended. No sign of trauma, no blood. Only the terrible clean fact of death in the wrong place. Lewis was waiting. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Instead I bent me slowly, my knee protesting with indignant modesty, and looked at the man's hand, fingernails clean. Fingertips worn, a faint callus on the index. Right-handed. The tie was askew, not with violence but haste. His shoes were polished, but the laces were frayed, the kind of detail that suggests something quietly misaligned. Something that had been out of place long before he found his way beneath this stone. I stood and said nothing. Sometimes it begins not with blood or a scream, but with dust, with old stone, with the sound of a crossword pencil left unfinished, and a letter that will never be answered. He was already dead, of course. They always are by the time we arrive, though I've never stopped thinking of it as arriving too late. Dr. Felix Caro, a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in over a decade, though it had once been mentioned with the reverence Oxford reserves, for those who could both quote Schlegel in fluent German and seduce a packed hall of undergraduates without once lifting their eyes from the lectern. Romantic literature. Byron mostly, a bit of Shelley when the wine ran dry. He was found twisted at the foot of the old servants' stairs behind the Clareton wing, a place not even the pigeons used now. Narrow, hemmed in with stone, the air slick with the memory of coal dust and old linen. The Clareton wing had been shut for years. Structural concerns, no budget for sentiment. The door at the top of the stairs, solid oak brass latch, and was locked from the inside. Not jammed, locked. There were no signs of forced entry. No scuff marks, no displaced mortar. The sort of pristine that feels arranged. Lewis read the name off the identification slip the pathologist had just confirmed, as if to ward off doubt. Caro. I said nothing. But I remembered. The grey-streaked hair worn long enough to suggest rebellion, the unbuttoned cuffs, the smell of Turkish tobacco even in seminar rooms that banned it. He had written a monograph once that argued Byron's melancholy wasn't poetic affectation, but the slow rot of guilt. A theory unpopular with those who preferred their heroes tragic but clean. Lewis handed me a small plastic evidence pouch. Inside a single sheet of paper, cream-deckled edge. A page torn from a book. The ink dense, the typeface slightly foxed. A stanza of Byron as expected. She walks in beauty like the night, one line underlined twice, not the one most would choose, not the moon nor the starry skies. Just that, she walks in beauty. I wondered whether it had been underlined before he fell or after. Lewis noted the absence of a wallet. A practical observation. I nodded. A thief who takes a wallet but leaves the poem. Perhaps sentiment isn't dead after all, but I wasn't looking at the paper anymore. I was looking at his shoes. Italian leather, deep oxblood, immaculate stitching. A man who once lived on lectureship, wages now wearing shoes that cost more than my weekly salary. But the soles, thin, ungritted, too soft. I stepped lightly down 2 of the stone stairs, my knee protesting again, this time ignored. Worn smooth over years of absent use, they had darkened unevenly in the damp. But something in the angle, of the body, the arms, the spread of the coat, it all said descent but not accidental. No scuff, no trip, no frantic grasp for balance. I turned to Lewis. Fell down the steps, I said. He nodded. Yes, sir. That's the early suggestion. I let the phrase hang there, fell. There are things that fall, apples, leaves, men in verse, but bodies, real bodies, they collapse. They are pushed. They are broken by the geometry of gravity and something else, something that does not rhyme. The door was still locked. The key, we were told, was found in his own coat pocket, unused, as if he had never intended to enter. Or had entered once, then stepped back, or never left at all. I asked about the coat. Camel hair. Old but not threadbare. The kind that once belonged to a man of taste, who had stopped being able to afford taste but wore it anyway. Lewis mentioned he'd been giving private tuition lately. No official college appointment. A few essays, an occasional appearance on Radio 4. A reputation dulled to obscurity. The sort of life that ends with silence. But something about that underlined line kept knocking at the edge of my attention. She walks in beauty, a woman then, or at least the memory of one. Perhaps that's what brought him back to Clareton, or kept him near. I looked once more at the door. Still unopened, still locked. Not everything that is closed is shut. Not everything that is locked was ever meant to be opened, and not everyone who falls does so alone. The senior common room at Balliol is not a room, but a mood, that particular strain of austerity made bearable only by the quiet scuff of worn carpet, the patient wheeze of central heating, and the tacit agreement that no one truly listens to anyone else before dusk. I arrived late in the afternoon, when the light begins to fall diagonally across the mullioned windows, and Oxford starts to rehearse its own mythologies. The porter, who knew me by name and temperament, nodded me through with the expressionless politeness usually reserved for ghosts. Inside, the room was half filled, not with people so much as shadows of them, each nursing a mug, a sherry, or a pretext. 3 remained when the others had vanished behind papers or doors. Professor Isla Travers was seated near the fireplace, legs crossed tightly at the ankle, one finger trailing the rim of her glass with surgical disinterest. She did not look up when I entered. Her face had the high-boned precision of someone who kept mirrors mostly for utility. No ornament, no smile, no invitation. Her discipline was comparative literature, her presence unspoken authority. Dr. Brian Halliwell occupied the far armchair as if he had arrived with it decades ago and never truly left. His corduroy trousers sagged like memory, and he wore his necktie loosened just enough to suggest rebellion, but not enough to provoke inquiry. A half-finished glass of red swayed faintly on the table beside him. The bottle near his foot bore the kind of dust one does not wipe away out of habit. Miss Margot Ely, standing closest to the window, gave the impression of someone not quite certain whether they'd been invited or had simply never been asked to leave. She held a thin paperback with both hands, her thumbs pressed flat against the spine. The librarian, I recalled, once Caro's student. Her expression when she met my eye was unreadable, a blend of deference and something older, sedimented over years. Admiration, perhaps, or its quieter twin. I said little. I've learned the most unguarded sentences arrive when one does not ask for them. Halliwell gestured toward a chair I had no intention of using. Heard about Felix, he said, too casually. Damn shame Travers lifted her glass. People always said he'd come to a poetic end. They just hoped it would be off-page. Ely said nothing. But the paperback she held, Shelley I saw now, seemed to bow slightly in her hands. I moved slowly to the edge of the room, pacing nothing in particular. My eyes drifted to the small cloakroom alcove to the left of the door, the kind meant to be overlooked. 4 coats, 2 hats, a cracked leather satchel with a broken clasp, and an umbrella, floral-handled, delicate, painted, not printed. Anemones, I thought, or perhaps forget-me-nots, the kind of thing one doesn't buy but receives. It did not belong. Not here among the greys and blacks and browns. The stand itself was brass, tarnished. I touched it lightly with my gloved hand, as though making space for a memory. I said nothing yet. Instead, I asked Travers about Caro's recent presence. Hardly ever seen, she replied, still not quite looking at me. Occasionally at high table. Said little, ate less. Always left the wine untouched. So unlike him, Halliwell muttered, raising his own. Miss Ely said quietly that Dr. Caro had inquired about Byron's annotated editions last week. She hadn't seen him herself, but his name had been on the sign-out log. Byron again. I let them speak, or rather, perform silence in their own styles. I've learned to listen for the absences in conversation. The names not spoken. The details added too quickly. The umbrellas no one claims. I left before the port closed. Travers didn't rise. Halliwell dozed as though nothing required waking. Only Miss Ely looked up as I turned back once, a glance like a page unmarked but folded slightly at the corner. Outside, the wind had shifted. The smell of wet bark and bicycle grease. I walked slowly past the old Clareton wing again, where stone pressed tighter. With each hour, there are places in Oxford where time does not pass, and others where it folds in on, itself like a forgotten umbrella in a cloakroom waiting for someone to notice. The Shelley volume was heavier than I expected, cloth-bound, worn at the corners, spine softened to the curve of long ownership. It sat like a relic on my desk, not quite breathing but listening. Caro's handwriting danced through the margins in a fine slate-blue ink, looping, elegant, measured. He had the kind of script that suggested a fondness for fountain pens and a distaste for laziness. I turned the pages slowly. Not out of reverence, but because the marginalia required a certain rhythm. You had to read the poem twice, once as written and again as he read it, and then I found it, page 143. Adonais, a scrawled note beside the 8th stanza, written at an odd slant. Not Caro's usual hand, not his usual ink. Green Keats, it read. As if the line belonged to him, but it didn't. He has outsoared the shadow of our night, Shelley wrote that. For Keats, not by Keats. Caro would never confuse the voice for the mourner. That kind of slippage was unthinkable to him, and yet there it was, dated even. 2 days before his body turned up at the foot of the Clareton steps, I stared at it. Not the words, but the colour. The ink glared back at me like a forced smile. Green, some people change pens. Caro didn't. He believed in continuity, even in the things that broke. I closed the book and placed it gently on the corner of my desk. Something was off-key, and the wrong note was still reverberating. I told Lewis we were going to the flat. Caro's place was off Norham Gardens, a narrow, ivy-draped building whose windows blinked wearily at the street. The kind of residence where books outnumber food and dust is never properly disturbed. We were let in by the landlord, who muttered something about back rent and cleared his throat more than he spoke. The flat was dim, curtains half drawn as if the light had long since been told it wasn't welcome, books everywhere, naturally. Along the walls beside the armchair, on the floor in careful stacks like hesitant altars, the air smelled faintly of paper, and something else, a distant echo of rosemary maybe, or cologne once worn regularly, now only lingering on old coats. Lewis opened the small fridge and found little but eggs and a forgotten cheese, but on the table by the window stood a bottle of wine, unopened, Côte du Rhône, not just any vintage, a rare one. The kind Caro would once have poured into thin glass goblets, quoting Baudelaire with indulgent melancholy. Lewis checked the label, then raised an eyebrow. Pricey, he said, indeed, and untouched. Beside the bottle, a single glass, not used, and a corkscrew laid out as if expecting company. I moved to the mantel. A row of books, a few old concert programs, a photograph frame face down. I didn't ask. I turned it empty, not broken, just empty, a frame that once held someone, now holding nothing. Lewis asked whether it meant anything. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked toward the window where the light tried faintly to make its way in. I looked down at the street, watched the shadow of a cyclist stretch and fold, and I hummed. Quietly. Just a phrase from an aria, Cavalleria Rusticana. Intermezzo. A tune. Caro once hummed himself. Late in the evening, when he thought no one was left in the lecture hall. A melancholy thing, not tragic, not resigned, just unfinished. Lewis asked if I recognized the melody. I said no, because sometimes it's not the music that matters, but the silence it interrupts. We left the flat as we found it, still breathing barely, but the green ink remained with me, a borrowed pen, or a borrowed hand, either way. It had written something false, and that, more than the misquoted line, was what didn't fit. We met beneath the dome, where the Bodleian Café pretends to be a refuge, and not merely a polite holding pen for the half-lost and half-late. Margot Ely arrived precisely on time. Hair neat, coat buttoned, book in hand, as not to read, but to anchor her presence. A librarian's trick. Appear always halfway between tasks. It gives you the power to leave before the conversation asks too much. She chose a seat by the far window, away from the hum of students and the clatter of espresso. I joined her wordlessly. She stirred her coffee before sipping it. 3 times clockwise. Not out of habit, I thought, but ritual. He'd grown nostalgic, she said. Tragic, even. Like someone rehearsing his own obituary. Her voice was level, careful. She didn't ask why I'd asked her to meet. She knew. Caro had lost a publishing contract, she continued. A collected edition of Byron's letters, annotated. Years of work undone in a single curt letter from the press. No funding. No appetite for scandalized poets in the age of citation metrics. He stopped coming in, she added. Avoided the senior reading room. Preferred to haunt the lower stacks, Byron. I said, as though lightly testing a thread for weakness. Her eyes flicked. A small shift, barely a tremor, but I saw it. He identified too much with him, she said. All that brooding, all that beauty. It was his comfort and his curse. I asked about Professor Travers. The pause was longer this time. They disagreed, she said, sharply, about ethics. Felix accused her of passing a graduate student's work off as her own. A footnote rearranged. An insight lifted without attribution. Nothing ever proven, of course. She tapped the rim of her cup. Once, and no one wanted it proven. I asked if Caro had taken it further. No, he let it curdle into resentment. Like he did with everything. That was his way. He'd rather bleed slowly than bandage quickly. Her words were sharp, but they left a strange warmth behind them, like a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years but still remembered the heat. And yet I said that you visited him. She hesitated. He was lonely, she replied. And loneliness is contagious. A student walked past our table and dropped a folded newspaper near the bin. It fell face down, pages splayed like an opened wing. I bent to retrieve it, intending only the small politeness of middle age. But my eyes caught the crossword. Number 27 across buried beauty. Lost to verse 7. The clue held still for a moment, then began to breathe. I turned back to Margot, who was watching me now with something quieter than curiosity. Did Caro ever write in green ink? I asked. No, she said. Too ostentatious. He believed color distracted from content. Then someone else did, I said. Someone who wanted us to think it was him, or someone careless enough not to know what mattered to him at all. She said nothing. But her hands, folded around the book now resting on the table, had begun to press too tightly at the corners. I finished my coffee, she said, almost as an afterthought, that Felix had stopped drinking near the end. Stopped drinking? Yes, you said it dulled the pain but also the poetry. And yet I thought a bottle of Côte du Rhône had waited for someone at his flat. Not for himself, then, for a guest, or for someone who never arrived. I thanked her and left. Outside, the wind pushed at the corners of the buildings, like an eager child trying to unlock a secret. I folded the newspaper under my arm and walked slowly past the Radcliffe camera, its dome solemn as a closed eye buried beauty. Lost to verse, 7 letters. Nothing came to me, but I felt it waiting. Just beneath the surface, as if Caro had left one final line, unwritten, and someone else had tried, poorly to finish it. It was Lewis who pulled the photograph from a long-forgotten folio in the college archive, a dusty green box tied shut with fading string and an institutional label that hadn't been legible since the Thatcher. Administration, the Clareton Wing, before time and rot closed its shutters. 4 figures seated on the low stone steps, Caro, Travers, Halliwell, and a 4th. The 4th had been blotted out, ink. Not scribbled in haste, but obliterated with purpose. A furious, deliberate act, the kind that requires not just anger, but the long patience of resentment. Caro looked impossibly young. Dark hair tousled with just enough carelessness to seem natural. He leaned toward Travers, whose expression even then resembled someone being photographed as a favor, not a choice. Halliwell wore a grin that hadn't yet soured into wine, but the 4th were gone. Only the posture remained. Crossed ankles, hands resting lightly on the knees, a tilt of the head toward Caro that suggested fondness or rivalry, hard to tell. Lewis peered over my shoulder and, trying not to smudge the corner, said something about dramatics. Maybe the play's the thing, he muttered. Back then they were all in some production or other, weren't they? Theatres and rivalries, romances backstage. All that, I made no reply. Not because he was wrong, but because I wasn't listening to the people. I was looking at the chairs, not the ones occupied. The ones behind, empty, misaligned, as though hastily rearranged before the shutter clicked, a small semicircle of stone benches worn at the edge. But what drew my eye wasn't the furniture. It was the stone beneath the erased figure's feet, a blur. A pale discoloration, not dust, not damage. Their pattern, faint, uncertain, as if a shadow had once been etched into the flagstones and was trying to remember itself. I knew it. It had taken days. But the image rose now, uninvited and precise, the bottom step behind the Clareton wing. Where Caro had been found, I had noticed the same pattern there, the suggestion of a circle just wider than a foot, worn differently to the surrounding stone. At the time, I'd dismissed it. Stone ages strangely. Memory plays tricks. But now, laid against this photograph, it sang. The erased figure had stood there once, in 1978. And again, I suspected, in the days before Caro died. I ran a finger lightly across the ink-blackened face. Someone wanted them gone. Not forgotten. That would require silence. But gone, removed, scratched out, denied a place in the memory. And yet there they were. Erasure always fails in the end. I turned to Lewis. Find out what plays were performed in 78, anything under the college's drama society. Check the names, not the leads. The understudies, the forgotten ones. He nodded, already halfway to the phone. I kept the photograph, not out of sentiment, but because I'd learned to hold on to things others try to destroy. They tend to matter. The wind had picked up again outside. I could hear it against the archive windows, that low, constant moan Oxford makes when it wants to be left alone. But the stones don't forget. The old steps behind Clareton told me so. Someone had stood there. Once loved, perhaps. Once necessary and then erased, but never quite gone, just waiting, beneath dust and ink and stone, to be noticed again. I chose the King's Arms, a little too crowded, a little too well lit, but Halliwell wouldn't have made it up the hill to the turf, and anything grander would have drawn out his self-importance like a bad cough. He arrived in a scarf he didn't need, and a jacket that remembered better decades. His tie was askew, though I suspected that was intentional, a kind of homage to his own dishevelment. He ordered the wine before I had a chance to offer, a Chateauneuf du Pape, as though he were still dining at high table, not leaning on a pub's sticky varnish. By the second glass he'd begun to loosen. He always did. Halliwell wore his memories like ill-fitting gloves, reluctant to admit they were his, but unable to stop fidgeting with them. "Caro," he said, swirling the glass too theatrically. "Ah, Felix? Always thought he was Lord Byron without the syphilis." I let the comment sit in the air between us, sour and faintly ridiculous. He could charm a room blind, Halliwell continued, and then walk straight into ruin. I asked about ruin. Halliwell sniffed, drank, then leaned in as though the table itself had earned his confidence. "There was a girl," he said. "Student. Second year, I think. Bright. Unwise." He waved the word away as though it covered a multitude of sins. It was the late 70s. Everyone was still pretending not to notice things like boundaries, and Caro, too romantic, thought he could love and lecture without consequence. It nearly ruined everything. And what happened? Halliwell hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but memory's vanity. He wanted to be the only one who remembered, but not the only one who carried it. "Travers," he said finally. "She handled it." I asked how, with silence. "And grace. And teeth." Travers always knew how to protect the institution. And herself. He said the word again, institution. And that was what caught, not the friend. Not the man, not Caro, but the institution. I asked what happened to the student. Halliwell looked out the window. It had begun to rain, the sort of rain Oxford wears well. Thin, persistent, soundless. She left, he said, disappeared, no complaint, no paper trail. Felix took a sabbatical the following term, and when he returned, the college had decided it was better to remember his lectures than his mistakes. "Convenient," I said. He refilled his glass, though his hand trembled now. "We were all complicit," he said. "That was the style back then. Preservation above pain. Quiet above truth, I let him speak. She taught us, you know, Travers, how to survive. I said nothing, but I thought about the word again. Survive, not flourish. Not lead, survive, and Caro had not. The girl had, if she existed, and I suspected she did, had vanished into that long corridor of forgotten casualties. What Travers had protected was not a man or a friend. It was a structure, a place, a reputation. And perhaps in doing so she had offered someone, maybe herself and something else, immunity, or leverage, or the slow, delicious safety of revenge, aged like a wine no one ever intended to share. Halliwell had grown quiet. The rain streaked the window like forgotten ink. He turned to me suddenly, his voice low, thick. You know, she never really forgave him. Not for the scandal, for the weakness. He made her choose. And she hated that. Then he slumped back in his chair, the performance finished, the curtain dropped. I walked him home, though he barely noticed. He quoted Virgil once beneath his breath and tried to light a cigarette that didn't exist. Back in my flat, I opened my own bottle. Cheaper, colder. I stared at the glass. Sometimes silence doesn't protect. It defers. And eventually, it returns the favor. It was Margot who brought the book, wrapped in brown paper, as if that might soften its contents. He hadn't returned it, she said. The last thing he checked out. A week before the 4 quartets. Eliot's long farewell to time, to faith, to coherence. She set it on my desk with a gentleness that suggested more than procedure. Her fingers lingered an extra breath, then withdrew. I thanked her and she nodded. That tight librarian's nod, equal parts farewell and warning. I waited until she had gone. The spine cracked faintly. The smell of the book was dust and ink and skin oil. The small, human residue left by readers who hold too tightly. I found it almost immediately. The torn edge came just after East Coker. A rough, inelegant rip, not cut. The kind of tear made by someone in haste or grief. But not indifference. I didn't need to guess. I already knew which page had gone missing. In my own copy, it was the passage I had once returned to in a winter of silence. Do not let me hear of the wisdom of old men, but rather of their folly. And later, the only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. I remembered reading those lines once in a hospital waiting room, the page trembling slightly as I turned it. Caro would have underlined the same ones, but now it was gone and I knew where it might have gone. Travis's office was locked. I waited in the corridor outside until the secretary had stepped away to take a call. A minute, no more. I had never been good at patience when it came to words. Inside the office was what I expected. Immaculate, spare, quietly self-impressed. The books were arranged not alphabetically but thematically, as if intimacy with their ideas outweighed any need for order. I scanned the shelves quickly, and there it was, the same edition. I slid it down with care. The pages yielded softly as if already complicit. Near the back, folded flat between little Gidding and the end papers, was a letter. Not mailed. Yellowed, creased at one corner. Inside it, the missing page, folded once then again, on its reverse, a line of Latin, scrawled in a hand I recognized, though it had aged. Lapis sub umbra servat debitum. A stone beneath shadow keeps the debt. I said the words aloud, but only to myself, a phrase from somewhere older than us both. Below it, no name, only an initial. F.I. closed the book and returned it to the shelf. Slowly, Lewis found me back in my office. He noticed the book but not my expression. He asked what I'd found. I told him nothing specific. He waited. And when I didn't speak, he sat, quietly. That was one of Lewis's better instincts, knowing when not to prod the... Bruce, I turned the phrase over in my mind. A stone. Beneath shadow, a debt. This wasn't a quote from Eliot. This was older. Possibly monastic, possibly invented. But its meaning was clear to me. Caro had carried something, buried it. Beneath stone, beneath Clareton. Beneath the steps where his body was found, a secret owed or forgiven or never quite either, and Travers, she had kept the page. Hidden it, not destroyed. Not returned, which meant it still meant something, not love. That wasn't her idiom, but maybe guilt, or control, or the slow echoing memory of betrayal. I didn't translate the phrase for Lewis. Some things, I've found, should remain unshared. Not because they're dangerous, but because speaking them aloud dulls their edge. I watched the light shift across my desk, then fall, the day closing in again. The debt, whatever it was, remained, waiting beneath stone, beneath shadow, and not, it seemed, done with us yet. I returned to Caro's flat alone. It had rained earlier, lightly, without commitment. The kind of rain that doesn't wash anything clean, but lays a quiet sheen over Oxford stone, as if to remind us that nothing stays buried forever. The landlord hadn't changed the locks. He still believed in the decorum of death. The room smelled faintly of paper and damp wool, the perfume of solitary men who've outlived their importance. I went back to the desk, not the top drawer, nor the second. He would have known those would be searched. Caro, for all his theatrical ruin, was meticulous, too proud to hide things clumsily. It was the bottom drawer, the one that resisted slightly when pulled. It came out no more than halfway before catching. I felt along the back panel, a notch. Then the faintest shift in pressure. The false wall slid free with a sigh. Inside, wrapped in a faded scarf and purple, silk, perfumed faintly of something floral and long gone, was a diary, leather-bound, scuffed, no lock. I sat with it. The first page bore a year. The entries were brief, compressed, as if the writer didn't trust the paper with too much. April 9th. Saw him again in the quad. He won't look at me. Travers watches everything. April 13th. She said it was foolish, said it would end badly. But he touches my hand like it's the only thing he still believes in. April 22nd. He missed the meeting. No explanation. The wine in his office had been opened. Not the usual kind, and then May 3rd. She cornered me in the chapel corridor. Said I was endangering his career, hers too. Said I didn't understand what people like me were allowed to want. May 12th. He said he'd speak to the college. Said he loved me. But he was shaking when he said it. I think he already knew. May 14th. She said she'd ruin me. She said. The sentence trailed off, no further pages. No signature. The ink, green. I ran my thumb along the margin. The pressure of the pen was uneven. Quick. This wasn't Caro's voice. The rhythms were wrong. There was a vulnerability here that Caro never allowed. Even in his worst moments he cloaked his grief in quotation. But this was bare, unfinished. I pulled the photograph from my coat pocket. The 1978 image. The four figures on the Clareton steps, Caro, Travers, Halliwell, and the fourth, and blotted out in ink their posture. The tilt of the head. The shadow at the foot. I could see it now. This diary was theirs, not Caro's. Someone once close enough to love him, and dangerous enough to someone else to be erased. I thought of the missing page from the four quartets. The note in Travers's book, Lapis sub umbra servat debitum. A stone beneath shadow keeps the debt. This diary, this voice, was the debt. I sat back and closed the cover. The scarf it had been wrapped in, delicate, once elegant, clearly not Caro's, a gift perhaps, or a keepsake. I placed the diary carefully back on the desk, but did not conceal it again. Some things once found ought not to return to darkness. Back in the evening light, Oxford leaned inward, spires cloaked in mist, lamplight pooling on cobbles like ancient gold. I walked slowly, not toward answers, but toward something. Older and the echo of a life erased, not by time, but by deliberate hands. She said she'd ruin me, and someone had, but not entirely. The voice remained, just quiet enough to be missed, just loud enough now to matter. The name came buried in the margins, A half-legible line on a dated student roll for Trinity term. 1978, not even typed, penciled in, and then crossed out in a darker, firmer hand. Brent. Evelyn AI spent the morning with the archivist, who offered me a cup of instant coffee and the kind of wary respect reserved for policemen who read poetry. She was a literature student. First-class essays in her first year, supervised by Caro, scheduled to deliver a paper on Child Herald before Hillary term. And then nothing, no formal withdrawal. No disciplinary note, just disappearance. I found her, or what remained of her, in a home outside King's Lynn, a place where time hummed quietly through radiators, and the staff spoke in softened tones, meant for those who know. Longer answered quickly Evelyn Brent, 70, though she looked younger from a distance, and older up close. The effect of stillness, the matron warned me she rarely spoke. Days would pass in silence, then a single phrase might drift out and unsettle the air. I sat beside her by the window. There were daffodils outside, though she didn't seem to notice them. I said his name, Felix Caro. Her eyes flickered. Not surprise, something else. Memory without context. Recognition without consent. He wrote me letters, she murmured. Her voice was papery, uneven, like breath catching on a splinter. He said it was never her fault. I didn't ask who her meant. She didn't need to say. I told her I'd read part of a diary. She closed her eyes, not in refusal, but as if bracing. I waited. Eventually she whispered. They said. I misunderstood. They said I imagined it. But I knew the way he looked at me. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, as if they too remembered being held against their will. I asked gently what happened after. Expelled, she said. Her mouth twisted around the word as though it had never fit. Her father couldn't forgive the shame. Her mother took her to a clinic, said she needed rest. She never returned to Oxford, never studied again. Her life unmade silently, by 3 protectors of academic dignity, Caro, Travers, Halliwell, each with their own reason for keeping her name off the record. Each perhaps believing the silence would fade, but some silences age badly. Before I left, the nurse brought in a small box marked with her initials. Inside, among dog-eared postcards and a dried corsage, was an umbrella. The handle was floral and anemones hand-painted, delicate against the dark lacquer. It had been found, I was told, at a library in Oxford. Left behind, never claimed. She'd gone back then at least once, perhaps to see Caro. Perhaps for closure. Perhaps to retrieve something lost, only to find that the place no longer saw her. Unnoticed. She'd left the umbrella behind, and still no one asked. I returned to Oxford with it in my hand. The stand in the senior common room still held its silence. The umbrella had been there days before Caro's death. Someone had seen it, chosen not to mention it, or had understood exactly what it meant and said nothing. I placed it on my desk that night. The pattern in the lacquer seemed to shift in the lamplight. Not decoration. A memory. He wrote her letters. He said it was never her fault, but he hadn't saved her. None of them had. Now only she remained, and even she had mostly gone. But her umbrella had stayed, like a whisper left open in a room no one dared enter. And someone, I suspected, had heard it, had seen it, and had decided the past needed an ending. One written not in verse, but in silence. Ink and stone. Her office was quiet when I entered. Not hushed, that would imply reverence. This was cultivated quiet, the kind one layers deliberately over decades, until even footsteps feel like an intrusion. Professor Isla Travers stood by the window, spine straight, arms folded. She did not greet me. She didn't need to. I placed the torn page on her desk, folded intact. She didn't touch it. So, you've read it, she said. It wasn't a question. The Latin, I replied. The handwriting. The photograph. The diary still she did not move. He wanted to confess, I said. She turned then. Just enough to meet my eyes, of course he did. Felix always mistook remorse for nobility. You wrote the note. Lapis sub umbra servat debitum. A stone beneath shadow keeps the debt. She exhaled, the faintest dismissal. He had begun talking, asking questions. The wine was just an invitation. He wanted someone to pull the truth from him, to absolve him. I said nothing. She walked to the edge of her desk, rested her hand lightly on the corner. You have no idea what we lose when reputation goes. She said it not with anger, but with an aching fatigue. You think it's about guilt, she said. It never is. It's about shame. He was going to publish something, I said. A memoir, she said, letters, hints, a footnote here, a memory there. Nothing explicit. But we knew, and Evelyn? She didn't even flinch at the name. That chapter was meant to end quietly, it had, until he decided to resurrect it. So you wrote the page. You made it look like his. The misquoted line, the ink he never used. She gave a tired smile. He kept everything. Even his old pens. It was never difficult to imitate someone who no longer knew who he was. You visited him, I said. I watched her. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. He still wanted me to absolve him, even after all those years. Even after Evelyn, she turned away then, back to the window. But absolution requires truth. And truth burns things down. There was no apology in her voice. No bitterness either. Only calculation, and the faintest trace of something older, grief perhaps, the kind that wears a mask for so long it forgets how to take it off. He fell, I said. She didn't respond. Did you push him? She faced me again. Her eyes were glass. He stepped backward. That's all. And the door? She looked beyond me now, somewhere past the past. He left it locked, always. Even to himself I held her gaze. For once she looked tired. Not defeated, just done. I told her Lewis would be in touch. She nodded almost imperceptibly. I walked out without another word. In the corridor the air was cooler. The college walls pressed in faintly as if listening. Outside Lewis waited. Anything? He asked. She doesn't deny it, I said. And you? I shook my head. There'll be enough. Between the diary, the umbrella, the note, her silence will speak. He nodded, already reaching for his notebook. I left him there, among the living. My steps carried me down the path toward the old Clareton wing, where light fell unevenly through the branches. The same spot. The same stones where Felix Carrow had fallen. Not pushed. Not pulled, just lost. He had wanted to be forgiven, but by the wrong person. He had asked truth to spare him, and it hadn't. I stood there a long time. The shadows lengthening. The debt had been paid, but not cleared. Some confessions arrived too late, and some are written only in translation, misquoted, misplaced, misunderstood. What remained now was silence, and even that I no longer trusted. The flat was dark when I returned. I left it that way. Some places wear shadow better than light. I poured a glass of wine, something ordinary, unopened for weeks. Not celebration, not ritual, just the gesture of ending. The newspaper still lay folded on the arm of the chair, its corner slightly curled from the radiator's breath. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases as though it mattered. The crossword was already half done, my marks. Fair few left unfinished. 27 across, buried beauty, lost to verse 7. I stared at the clue again. It had been there all along, waiting, EVELYN 7 letters. I filled it in. Evelyn. The name settled into the page quietly, as though it had always belonged. I set the pen down and leaned back, the wine untouched. Outside, the skyline of Oxford flickered beneath thin cloud. College spires, domes, chimneys, trees older than their names, all silhouetted in that peculiar kind of darkness Oxford reserves for its endings. Not absence, but distance. I thought of the photograph. The 4 faces, 3 clear, 1 erased. I thought of the stone pattern beneath her feet, half buried in moss. The umbrella, too delicate for that room of men. I thought of Evelyn Brent and the quiet years folded around her like bedclothes too heavy to lift. She was never buried beneath stone. That had been a misreading, a metaphor taken too literally. She was buried beneath silence, the kind that compacts over time, layer by layer, until even memory has to dig. Travers would be questioned. Halliwell would retreat into his wine and footnotes. The institution would move on, quietly, politely, as it always does. A few words in a report. An archive entry amended. Perhaps a fellowship renamed someday for the sake of irony. But, Evelyn, there would be no memorial. No one would chisel her name into the steps behind Clareton. Only that word in a crossword, a clue solved far too late. I didn't sleep that night. Watched the city shift from charcoal to ash, from shadows to mist, the kind of dawn that doesn't quite arrive but waits. And just before light broke, I pulled out a page of plain paper, wrote her name once, Evelyn Brent, at the top. Then I began a letter. Not a report. Not a confession. Something quieter. I wrote of the umbrella. The floral handle, the book she had never been allowed to finish. I wrote of Felix Caro and the letter he never sent. The one she had waited for. I wrote of Travers and her voice like marble, and Halliwell quoting Virgil to himself in empty rooms. I wrote of silence, not the noble kind, but the kind that erases, the kind that cloaks betrayal in procedural language and leaves truth folded into drawers no one opens, the kind that ruins people and calls it order. When I finished, I did not sign my name. I folded the page once, then again, and slid it into a plain envelope. No address, just for her. I placed it in the drawer where I keep my cufflinks and old maps, the ones with names that no longer exist. Then I opened the window, letting the morning air slip in, cool, distant, salted, faintly with bicycle grease and the breath of unread books. The letter would never be sent, but that was never the point. Some truths aren't for justice, they're just for remembering, and remembering, I have come to believe, is its own quiet form of grace.